Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. This is Sopo.
And I'm Brian. And today on the podcast, we welcome Adam Alimi. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Politics in York University, Toronto, Canada. And my research interests are in the field of development, Marxist theory of dependency in particular, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is also one of my research interests.
So I invited you onto this podcast because I read your article, Beyond Empire, Why the Soviet Invasion and Withdrawal of Afghanistan Was Different. So could you just outline what is this article about? What are you saying? What are you arguing?
Yeah, so the two questions that I had for this research and this paper is how to make sense of Afghan modernity. Where does it begin? Where does it end? So that's an issue of periodization. And on the issue of scale, how do we make sense of the various connections, imperial connections? We can also call them diplomatic connections, cultural connections throughout the 20th century. Because Afghan modernity itself was a product of global history, right? When Afghanistan became independent in 1919, and even before that, a lot of the leaders were looking at ways to improving their position in their world, right? So they would not be the subject of former empires, et cetera, right? So Afghan modernity was intimately wound up in this process of anti-imperialism. And so in that sense, there was a lot of connections as well to things that were happening in the new Turkish Republic, Iran, the Soviet Union, and et cetera, right? In the 20th century, the United States was also not calling itself an empire. It kind of positioned itself as an anti-colonial endeavor, although we know not to take that, seriously, right? So the issue that I had was, how do we make sense of Afghan modernity? Like, where does it begin? Where does it end? And then how do we view how do we make sense of the various imperial connections? So on these two questions, global historians have helped us a lot. But at the same time, as I argue, they've also muddled concepts of empire and modernity. The reason for this muddling is because there's a certain methodological indifference to their analyses. So they point out different imperial connections, they point out different interpretations of Afghan modernity, but ultimately it doesn't help us make sense of why Afghanistan collapsed. Why did it become, the center of the world, of world destruction, right, throughout the 1980s. Some people blame the communists, but obviously, the communists were anchored in history, right? A lot of these global historians have even helped us dispel the idea that the communists were imported because of, let's say, Soviet-Afghan educational exchange, or because there were a couple of adventurers in Afghanistan, right? So a lot of them have helped us dispel those ideas. They've shown that, Afghan communism, for instance, much like Islamism and liberal reform as well, but that they have been products of regional connections, right? Regional processes. So we can discuss the Afghan communists. I mean, a lot of the Afghan communists they came out of the nationalism movement that the Afghan government was promoting in the early 20th century. So early modernizers, early state builders, they had promoted nationalism. And nationalism was linked with the production of new schools, and to create these functionaries that would help Afghanistan essentially modernize. But throughout the course of the 20th century, the nationalist movement had split. It went into different directions. Some people became communists, others became Islamists. There were, other shades of liberal reform, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, all these modernists, all these strands had regional connections, right? So obviously the Afghan communists were inspired by what was happening in Central Asia. Some of them had listened to radio broadcasts of what was happening in Soviet Tajikistan, for instance. Others were also fascinated with the Communist Party in Iran, right? It had this regional element, right? The first leader of Afghanistan's Communist Party, Nur Muhammad Taraki, he had picked up communism in India, right? So in a sense, so there was a trans-regional element to Afghan communism, but as I've argued, it was, or as people have also shown as well, it was also linked to the nationalist movement. And a lot of these different groups, whether they were communists or Islamists, they responded to the increasing failures and shortcomings of the ruling monarchy, of the Afghan ruling monarchy, and their modernization efforts, right? So even though the Afghan monarchy, the Afghan kings, the kingdom had provided schools, had built armies, roads, and a lot of this was done because of Soviet assistance, American assistance, German assistance, etc. So even though there was modernization, a lot of these groups were critical about the pace of the modernization, and so on and so on. So a lot of global historians, they help us with these processes. They point out the different imperial connections, and they point out the different interpretations of Afghan modernity. But ultimately, they can't help us explain why Afghanistan destroyed, right? Why is Afghanistan the poorest country in the world? Why was Afghanistan the subject of Al-Qaeda, of the Soviet invasion as well, right? Why was, so what helps us explain that? What helps us make sense of Afghan modernity? And this is what the existing scholars can't help us explain, right? Just because Islamists, for instance, they use modern communication technology, they, somehow they use modern weapons, doesn't make them actually modern, right? Just because liberal reformists are advocating for democracy doesn't necessarily make them more modern, right? In the course of Afghan history, like, what I argue is that Afghan communists become the successors of modernization in the 20th century. They are rooted right within that society. Some of them, were parliamentarians. A lot of them actually come from the family of the middle class sort of elite, right? So a lot of them come from that background, which is the case in many other parts of the third world, right? But nonetheless, they have ambitious projects in mind. And when they surface in the 60s and 70s, the Afghan Communist Party is formed in 1965. When they surface around these times, they do become the successors of the monarchy in a sense, right? Given the course of history, they're able to organize. And part of that is because the Soviet Union and Afghanistan have the closest relations, right? And this is not something that Afghanistan, it just magically happens, right? There's reasons for this. The reason why the Soviet Union and Afghanistan have a close relationship is because other parties rebuked Afghanistan. In 1954, for instance, when Afghanistan wants to modernize its army, the US says no, because they are interested in keeping Pakistan happy. And they, and Pakistan and Afghanistan have tenuous relationships because, the borders were forced. The borders separating Afghanistan and Pakistan were forced on the Afghans because of the British Empire. And a lot of Afghans reject the border which, separates the Pashtuns, right? So for all sorts of reasons, Afghanistan is oriented towards the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And this is why this is what helps us explain why the communists are better able to organize within the state structure and even within the countryside better than other parties, right? Then the liberals, for instance, they exhaust themselves, right? Throughout the course of the 20th century, in the 60s and 50s, Afghanistan experiments with democracy, right? And there are groups that are calling for it to go further, but nonetheless, the liberal reform process exhausts itself. The Islamists, well, they're not well organized, and eventually they link up with the Pakistani state in the 60s and 70s, and this is why the government, Dawood Khan in the 70s, like this is partly why he kicks them out, right? He kicks them out, and then the communists at one point become empowered, and then later Dawood Khan doesn't like that the communists are gaining ground, so he tries to kick them out as well. And this is what ultimately spurs the communist revolution in 1978. So in short, to say that the communists are not a random group that acquires power in 1978. If we take the 20th century history seriously, then we learn that they are well positioned to take power. And this is something that even a lot of mainstream historians have pointed out. Nonetheless, they take issue with the Soviet invasion, with the occupation. And here I would just say that, well, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have a situation in which Afghanistan is organically oriented towards the Soviet Union and then problematize the Soviet invasion and go so far as to kind of caricature it, right? In my article, I argue that the Soviet Union is not an empire, right? And there's literatures on this, right? There's literatures as it relates to Central Asia, as it relates to the Third World. We can get into this, but there are these literatures that show why actually the Soviet Union is at the forefront of what we can call alternative world making, right? Or in short, anti-imperialism, of offering alternatives.
Why were you interested in this topic in the first place?
On the one hand, I had done some research on Afghanistan in my master's, and on the one hand, I was always uneasy with the way history was being written on the country. And I felt that the Soviet period was not properly understood. It was not properly defined in the history of the 20th century. And let me put it let me put it also in a different way. So that was one thing. That's more of a historical aspect. But more recently, when Kabul fell, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban in 2021, I was kind of shocked with the Taliban's return and of the collapse of the US in Afghanistan. And it's not because I wasn't aware of the situation on the ground or I hadn't, there was various reports that had shown that the regime was going to collapse. There was no morale in the army. The Taliban had gained all sorts of territory, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, I was kind of shocked, right? Because the United States is a big imperial power, and this didn't need to happen, right? The United States here abandoned their allies in Afghanistan, despite all the problems that their project was consumed with. And automatically, I thought back to the Soviet period, where once the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, their local allies had survived. They were able to withstand the Soviet retreat. And the Afghan communists at the time, they had rebranded themselves as nationalist, or Najibullah's government at that time was able to survive. And his government only collapsed in 1992 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And part of the reason for that is because the Soviets had continued to support their allies in Afghanistan to the very end. And so I thought of that as something that's kind of romantic, and I don't mean that in a, in a sort of silly way, but it's because, it reminded me that the Soviet-Afghan connection was more intimate. The Soviet Union and Afghanistan have had an intimate connection. The Soviet Union was the first to recognize Afghanistan's independence in 1921, and likewise, Afghanistan was the first to recognize the Soviet Union in 1923. So their relationships go back 100 years, and there is a type of special relationship. Part of that is also because Afghanistan borders Soviet Central Asia. So the Soviets have, and the Afghans respectfully, they have been concerned with having, positive relationship. And, throughout the 20th century, part of the reason why I had an issue with the way that the Soviet invasion was framed is because it abstracted from, the long array of Soviet-Afghan ties. So as I argue in my paper, Afghan modernity itself was anchored in the Soviet shadow. And this was done through diplomatic ties, through the Afghans being also inspired by the progress in the Soviet Union, and through other such mechanisms in the course of history. Some of them being accidental, some of them being more structural, and we can get into that later.
Just for the context for people who are listening to this, you mentioned that there's this longer term story of Afghan-Soviet connections, and that Soviet modernity had an influence on the development of Afghan modernity. And this was prior to the emergence of a communist party in Afghanistan. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, that is correct. So the course of Afghanistan's history, there are various geopolitical, economic, and also political developments in Afghanistan's 20th century that link them towards the Soviet Union, or that kind of orient them towards the Soviet Union at the expense of other regional powers. And this is why I had issues with scale, because a lot of recent Afghan scholarship, historiography, points out to Afghanistan's global history in the 20th century. Timothy Noonan has written a brilliant book called Humanitarian Invasion, and he looks at all these different imperial connections, right? And he tries to make sense of them. And others have done this as well. Other scholars have done this as well. But a lot of these scholars can't make sense of, okay, how do we understand Afghan modernity? Like, what is Afghan modernity? Like, often what these scholars do is they connect the various imperial connections to different interpretations of Afghan modernity. Afghan modernity was not just the product of the Afghan communists, right? Before that, it was also the product of the Afghan nationalists and the Afghan Islamists. So what a lot of global historians have done is that they've connected these different imperial connections to different interpretations of Afghan modernity. But nonetheless, they can't help us explain how Afghanistan collapsed, in the 1980s or 1990s, or at least they don't have a sense of getting to the root, right? So in my perspective, in this sense, they end up muddling empire and Afghan modernity, because they don't offer an explanation for Afghanistan's collapse. So I mean, in a sense, they do. So one of the scholars, so in a sense, they do offer explanation, but it's a situation where Afghanistan is the one that's collapsed, that's worn torn, that becomes, Afghanistan is the one that suffers the consequences of, let's say, global history, right? So in that sense, it becomes an object of fascination. But when it comes to explaining modernity itself, of clarifying, okay, how do we make sense of modernity in the arc of the 20th century? Is there a certain continuum, right? In that sense, there is no explanation. A lot of recent scholarship, it has helped to broaden our understanding of Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of interesting connections, regional connections, historical connections that help us appreciate Afghan history. So a lot of this historiography is moving in the right direction, but ultimately it still doesn't help us understand what Afghan modernity is, right? I mean, in a sense, a lot of these different explanations and dimensions to the story that global history makes clear, they, instead of appearing as something intelligible, they are actually like they muddle Afghan modernity, and they make Afghan modernity unintelligible. And this is a point I really want to get across. And part of this is, and I think here's the key, part of this is because the imperial connections and the global connections that, when we think about Afghanistan, a lot of these imperial global connections, they're not differentiated, right? So the Soviet connection is, the Soviet connection to the story is supplied, the American connection, the British connection, the Pakistani connection, etc., right? But they're not differentiated, right? This is why I said that there's this methodological indifference. And what this ensues is that, we can't make sense of Afghan modernity, right? So you have someone like, and I don't want to pick on her because I like her work, Elizabeth Leake, right? She wrote a book about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And, her thesis is that it's a rupture and it's a continuity, right? That's her way of getting around it. But I think this is, how can that be? Like, how can it be both at the same time? I know where this is coming from. This is post-colonialism and decolonialism. And this is the suspicion of grand narratives. This is the cultural turn. This is the focus on knowledge production and not political economy, not actually anti-imperialism, right? So this development, which has infected academia, I don't think is the way we should go, because ultimately, despite whatever knowledge we grasp from Afghanistan, the reality is most Afghans, they really have been the victims of history and the victims of the world, not because there weren't forces of agency, of modernity, of progress there, but because there were other actors who acted to destabilize, right, Afghan modernity. As I said, Afghan communism was the only chance I think Afghanistan had. And it was something that was synthetic, organic. It wasn't something that's anachronistic. And I think, and so while I appreciate global historians help us to make sense of Afghanistan, its complex history, and while I appreciate the fact that we are also complicit, or this idea, while I appreciate the idea that the globe is complicit in Afghanistan's suffering, the reality is that Afghans suffer. It's not the globe, right? Afghans suffer. And just because you have a few who go out, who migrate, just because you have a few diaspora here and there, just because you have a few Afghan intellectuals now, it doesn't take away from the fact that, Afghanistan right now is at the behest of quite frankly, these reactionary forces, and even other forces. Like, recently there was earthquakes in Afghanistan. I don't know if you guys saw this. 800 people died in one earthquake. And why? Like, at this point in the world, we shouldn't be having this, right? And, the communists really tried to make the population legible, to provide, housing, services, et cetera, et cetera. Like they were the ones who promoted this agenda.
Your main thesis is that the Soviet invasion and the Soviet-Afghan relations is fundamentally different from the US one.
Well, it's different for several reasons. So the US was obviously involved in Afghanistan in the 20th century. and then later on in the 21st century. So I'm not saying that it's just different because the 1980s was different from the post-2001 period. But the idea that I'm trying to get across is that the Soviet Union and again, elites throughout the 20th century and modernizers, they had a vision of anti-imperialism. They had a vision of um, improving their position in the world, right? From the periphery, moving on up. So what I do in my paper is, I actually argue that the Soviet Union was not an empire. I take that bold position. And so if we don't understand the Soviet Union as an empire because it's helping Afghanistan develop, and in the arc of the 20th century, then, I think that we need to understand that invasion fundamentally different from the US intervention in the 1980s and then also in the post-2001 period.
Tell us about the Soviet-Afghan relations. Tell us about the lead up to the invasion.
Soviet invasion happens in December 1979. In April 1978, the communists take power in Afghanistan. And the Communist Party, since its inception, becomes divided. So the Communist Party forms in 1965 and is divided into two factions. One of them is called Khalq, and the other one is called Parcham. Khalq means masses, Parcham means banner. And people have talked about the divisions within the Communist Party. Some people have said it relates to ethnicity. Most of the Khalqis were Pashtun. Most of the Parchamis were Tajik. And they came from perhaps from more so from northern part of Afghanistan or belong to ethnic minorities. Some people say that there's also class differences to explain the parties. A lot of Khalqis came from lower class backgrounds. A lot of Parchamis came from the cities, and a lot of their relatives were functionaries within the Afghan state. So some people have there are different reasons to explain the factional disputes, but I think something that is more relevant for our purposes, because some of these claims on ethnicity and class have been disputed, right? What's more relevant is that the Parchamis from the founding were more nationalist in orientation. They were more, let's say, reformist or more moderate in tone, whereas the Khalqis would become more radical. And that could be because of the biographies of the different individuals, but that also can be because, all parties have divisions and factions, right? So this is a natural thing as well. So in 1978, when the coup occurs, it's the radical faction, the Khalqis, that commit the coup. And they're also, the Khalqis are well organized in the military. So, a lot of the officers received training in the Soviet Union. And so, there was those ties, right? So they're the ones who organized the Saur Revolution or the April Revolution in 1978. And right from the beginning, there are problems. There are problems in okay, well, what do we do now? How do we make the revolution? And in the beginning, before Afghanistan embroils and before the Soviet Union has to intervene, in 1978, there are these disputes on strategy, on the pace of reform, on the types of reforms to make, on the role of democracy, right? The Khalqis, ultimately, the radical faction, is the one that wins out, and they go on to pursue what some people have called radical reforms, such as land reform, literacy campaigns. They go on to reduce the bride price. So, reforms that reflect gender relations. But actually, when you look at these reforms, the reforms that the Khalqis make, they're actually not all that radical. And I argue this in my paper. I look mainly at the issue of land, but essentially all the reforms that they undertake are not all that radical. And if you consider the factional disputes between the Khalqis and Parchamis, you know, if you read the history, you can kind of understand why the Khalqis, decide to make the reforms, right? And the reason is because other options were exhausted, right? And also because of, the issue of resources, right? So, I think we should give them credit for taking these so-called radical reforms, which are not all that radical, because in the absence of reforms, right? Well, what else can you do? I mean, the 1970s had exhausted moderation, right? That's what the 1960s and 70s was. There was other, people would call them more democratic or more unified, whatever you want to call them, right? I mean, these pathways were exhausted. And it isn't to say that the Khalqis didn't make any mistakes. There were several mistakes that were made, right? Things that can be explained, but to view the reforms as something that is, wished out of thin air or adventurous or whatever synonym you want to use, I think is not realistic, right? Because a lot of the policies that they undertook, they were rooted in history. Some of the, like, as it relates to land reform, the previous Daoud Khan, he's the one who tried land reform before. He tried the exact same policy that the Khalqis enacted, but the locals, the elites resisted it, right? As it relates to centralizing power, right, the Parchamis were the more moderate faction, was more in favor of a national democratic front. But when the Khalqis gained power, right, there was already a party state in place, because Daoud Khan before had pushed back some of the democratic reforms that were made in the 60s, right? So when you actually look at the Khalqis in power in 1978 and the reforms that they made, they were quite natural. They were quite, there was those, what do you call those? There was those institutional continuity. The big reform was land reform. And the issue of land has often been overlooked in Afghanistan. And this is something that I really tried to highlight in my paper. Historically, Afghanistan is often viewed as a land of small farmers, right? Unlike other places like maybe Iran or Central Asia, there's usually, a lot of mainstream scholars have mentioned that there's an egalitarian distribution of land, right? But actually, as I argue, there were a lot of inequalities, right? There were a lot of inequalities, and a lot of these inequalities were, some of them, a lot of it is because of because of Afghanistan's environmental dynamics, but also because of the introduction of capitalist social relations in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which had exacerbated, or if you like, they had decomposed the tribal relations in Afghanistan, right? So what you'd see, and also, during the course of the 20th century, when there's modernization, the Afghan kings had given state lands to certain elites, right, to the certain khans, right? So by the time the communists appear on the political scene, there's a lot of land inequality. And there's a lot of studies that show, even studies from the West, that show that Afghanistan's land relations are inefficient, that there needs to be reforms, there needs to be distribution, right? And as I said, even before the communists come into power, Daoud Khan tries the land reform, but it doesn't work because so the land reform is to reduce ceilings on high-grade lands. And then what the elites do in Afghanistan is they divide the lands amongst their relatives. So it essentially stays in their hands, right? And so what happens in 1978, 1979 is the communists, the Khalqis in particular, tried to forcibly redistribute land. And a lot of this fails, and it fails for various reasons, right? The big problem is because of the comparative resources of the government. The governments, they don't have the seats, they don't have the credits, and in some cases, they don't have the capacities to increase irrigation as well, which limits land reforms. So ultimately, the land reforms fail. The land reforms kind of fail because the communists don't have those types of capacities. Now, as I say, there is an element of failure because the communists don't have the capacities, but also around this time, there are also a lot of groups, the opposition, the so-called mujahideen, several of these groups, a lot of them had already left Afghanistan before the communists take power. Some of them had even plotted to overthrow Daoud Khan, the government before the communists. And so what these guys do is when the reforms are taking place, they start undermining the reforms. So they start to go and kill Communist Party members who tried to increase literacy in the countryside, or who tried to tell members about the land reforms that are taking place. So in a sense, they're put in a very hard spot. The communists are put in a very hard spot with land reform, but nonetheless, they try. And I think we have to admire trying, because historically, Afghanistan has, the ruling monarchy has not been able to extract rent from agriculture. It has historically, it had relied on custom duties, and it had relied on foreign aid, precisely so it can carry favor with these elites, local elites, khans throughout Afghanistan. And some of them are very wealthy. As I mentioned in my paper, and as other scholars have noted, there are a couple of hundred of these elites who historically have had close ties to the Afghan government, who own large parts of the property. So I think it's something like 2.2% of the families own 42% of the land. And, the vast majority of Afghans had land holdings that were not conducive to survival, or were not conducive to sustainable reproduction. And so many of them had to go outside of the country for economic opportunities. Many of them had to flood the cities. Some mainstream scholars, they view this as positive. They try to view this mobility as, oh, look, this is a global history, right? But obviously it also reflects, it reflects the poor state of reforms, right, which the monarchy had neglected. And also, one of the issues about migration throughout the regions of Afghanistan is that, you're subject to the arbitrary policies of the countries where you migrate. So historically, Pakistan and Iran have sort of, Pakistan, because there's issues with the borders, has imposed conditions that sometimes make migration challenging, right? So, when the communists come into power, their policies, their reforms are, in a sense, admirable. Those are the things that have been neglected in previous decades. But as I say, they were, their chances were very slim, because the opposition, the various jihadi groups, some of them which had already linked up with the Pakistani state, they started to undermine, right, the reforms. When the communists come to power in 1978, a lot of Soviet technicians are invited already in 1978. This is before the invasion. So in a sense, they're there, they're advising, but evidence suggests that actually they're telling a lot of Soviet diplomatic cables and so on suggest that they're just advising, and they're telling the communists to be cautious, the local Afghan communists, the Khalqis in particular, to be cautious. But because they're the ones who know the situation, more on the ground, and because they're the ones who ultimately have that agency, they go ahead with the reforms, because And this is not something that I think should be understood as something it was unwise or et cetera, right? Like the history of state making involves taking risks. The history of making people, resources, legitimate, et cetera, the extending institution, it involves taking these risks. And some things succeeded, right? Like, initially when land reform was announced, so there was another aspect to land reform, which was reducing the debt that a lot of farmers had, right? And that was initially very popular. A lot of people a lot of the peasants, farmers were very happy with that. But ultimately, the government didn't have alternative resources. So, in a sense, the nature of the reforms were limited, right? To begin with. So in 1978, 1979, the reforms fail. The communists, it's true, they resort to violence to have a grip on the country. There's a lot of infighting that's happening initially between the different factions of the left, and then eventually it's between the Khalqis who are in power and then parts of the countryside. But again, it's hard to think about this in the absence of the opposition, the jihadis who are already causing trouble, who are undermining the reforms from the outset. So again, this is a very difficult situation. And then, what ends up happening is that throughout a year after the revolution, the communists take on they take a more of an unpredictable turn, right? Because they're caught in a difficult situation. And the first general secretary, Nur Muhammad Taraki, he's eventually killed by Hafizullah Amin. Hafizullah Amin is often depicted as this, adventurous. I would read him more open-ended, right? He's the one who's forcing these reforms. Let's see what happens, et cetera, et cetera. But then ultimately, the Soviets become frustrated at him as well, because he kills Taraki, and so the good faith between the Soviets and Amin kind of sour, and then Amin at one point, months before the invasion, he starts to turn to Pakistan, right? He starts to sort of turn to Pakistan, and then at this point, this is when the Soviets, they develop a plan with the Parchamis, the more moderate factions, to invade. And then so ultimately the invasion occurs in 1979, December 1979. And a lot has been said of the invasion, right? A lot has been said of the invasion, that when the Soviets invaded, Afghanistan was doomed to fail, right? Again, I would disagree with this. Because we could talk about what happened during the occupation, right? But ultimately, the Soviets were able to shore up an Afghan Communist Party. Many of the reforms that the communists would have liked to see, did not come during the 1980s because of the nature of the war that happened, right? So I mean, despite the fact that there were positive developments, the Soviets had invested in natural resources, in natural gas, and the Soviets had developed all these geological surveys to help Afghanistan stand on its own feet, so it can, I mean, previously it was indebted, right? All throughout the 20th century, it was indebted to various different parties, right? So the Soviets were genuine, and the scholarship proves this. The Soviets were genuine in trying to help the Afghans stand on their feet, but ultimately, because of the regional environment, and also because the Soviet Union was at its later stages, this period did not turn out the way that the Afghan communists would have wanted to. But nonetheless, upon withdrawal, the Afghan communists, they at this point they have reformed a little bit, and they have made peace with some groups, and they have renounced certain elements of their identity. They're now banking on this new nationalism, right? But nonetheless, the forces in Kabul are able to survive. And at this point, as I argue, Afghan modernity was still a viable project.
Soviet invasion, the withdrawal, and then we all know that you get the rise of this right-wing jihadist kind of politics in a place like Afghanistan and the region when communism is gone. So maybe if you could just give a kind of concise overview of, the end of communism in Afghanistan, how does this then bring about kind of reactionary forces?
Okay, so throughout the 20th century, the Soviet Union was at the forefront of alternative world making, and I argue this in my paper. And we can think of this if we look at what's happening in Central Asia. And Central Asia is important because of the relationship to Afghanistan and borders on Afghanistan. But also, if we think about the third world, the Soviet Union was really at the forefront of progressive, let's say, movements that were helping a lot of the decolonized world improve their status in the world, right? And so this had entailed supporting national economies, nationalization, armies as well, and national integrity, etc., and being able to defend yourself, against the West and against former empires, right? Against former capitalist empires, right? We really need to think of capitalist empires as ones that are interested in divide and conquer, in extracting resources from the decolonizing world. So a lot recently has been made about alternative world making. There's a lot of recent interesting research about Bandung, about the United Nations, about third world countries, decolonizing countries, promoting alternative development, alternative world making. There's a lot of interesting scholarship. But as I point out in my paper, the reality is that many of this was aspirational, right? And it was the Soviet Union that promoted alternative world making, whether providing credits at very low, very modest interests, whether overcoming the limitation of the international trading systems, by promoting barter agreements. A lot of countries had difficulties because in the 20th century, because they incurred balance of payment problems. A lot of them did not have the hard currency to import goods. So what the Soviet Union did is that it created barter agreements to overcome this problem, right? The Soviet Union had also transferred entire industrial plants to the third world, whereas the Americans were more stingy and selective with what they were providing. And obviously the interests that they had provided on their loans were at higher rates. And so this was happening at that time. And as I said, the third world, I mean, South-South cooperation, or what we would think of that was more aspirational. So in this context, the United States was supporting certain nationalist regimes, what I would call a form of dependent development. So if the decolonizing country had agreed to incorporate itself into the world market that's led by the US, they would be rewarded to a limited extent. But this would have, and obviously many countries did not choose this, right? There was coups all over the 20th century, right? The United States had enacted coups all over the 20th century and in essence forced a lot of decolonizing third world nations into their sphere of influence. And this was essential, in the 20th century. This was not an exception. This was the norm in the 20th century, right? And ultimately, you saw in the Middle East that this had, in the case of Iran, this is what led to the rise of reactionary Islamism to become at the forefront of anti-imperialism, right? And one should also be very critical about Islamism and how Islamism was formed. Initially, Islamism in many places, and even in Afghanistan, was linked to nationalism. It had more moderate roots. So in a lot of ways, it was promoted by modernizing elites so that they can control mullahs on the local ground or whatnot, right? But also at the same time, the United States relied on Islamism as a counterweight to communism and as a counterweight to pan-Arabism, to et cetera, et cetera. So in the case of Afghanistan, there are some reports that I have seen that I think it's called the Asia Foundation. They're the ones that supported the faculty of Islamic jurisprudence in Kabul University, right? And the Asia Foundation or the Asia Society, it's one of them, was linked to the CIA, right? It was giving a lot of these educational grants to promote Islamism throughout the region. And then obviously there was, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then, a lot of these, the Baghdad Pact countries were, that was a collection of different interests per se, but all which had contributed to radicalization, in the Middle East, right? And as I mentioned in my article, the US invasion of Afghanistan was linked to all these processes. It brought the death of progress, right? So that's why Afghanistan is also interesting. It's the last communist sort of, it's coming incredibly late in 1978, and Afghanistan has all these limitations as poor state capacities and et cetera, like artificial nation state unposed in itself. All these sorts of things are sort of limiting Afghanistan. And in the 1980s, then really Afghanistan is used as this laboratory to promote jihadism, right, through Al-Qaeda and so on. And a lot of scholars have now linked the destruction in the Middle East to this new phase of monopoly capitalism or so. I mean, there's a lot of interesting research that shows that I think that whereas before maybe there was some development promoted in the region, I mean, what we've seen in the last 20, 30, 40 years is just destruction. It's just chaos. It's just, the United States, right, has promoted just this sheer destruction. And this is also emblematic of what's happening in Afghanistan, right? They justified the Taliban, the 2001, they wanted to remove the Taliban, but where are we now? We've ended up with the Taliban as well. So these reactionary forces, have resulted because alternative progressive movements in the region, like their course had failed, right? And this is especially the case, in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. So two things to consider when we compare the Soviet-Afghan war to the American war post-2001 is geopolitics and development. I'll start with development first. The Soviet Union channeled a lot of development resources through the Afghan state. And this is what helped the Afghan communists survive in Afghanistan, right? So a lot of the resources, planning that the Soviets channeled through the Afghan state, like this ensured stability. We didn't have the levels of corruption that we saw in the 2001 period. So in other words, a lot of the development assistance that the Soviets gave to the Afghans had a real local impact. Whereas in the post-2001 period, we know that 2/3 of American assistance to Afghanistan had no local impact. And Afghanistan post-2001 had become a laboratory of neoliberal global governance, right? The constitution in 2004 had, so much like Iraq, privatization. So you had a lot of, as such, you had a lot of corruption and cronyism. But again, I don't want to focus much on the Afghan actors. I mean, this is something that the United States put in place, given the way that it did not, given that it did not channel development aid through the Afghan state. 90% of development aid in Afghanistan was channeled outside the state, right? It was channeled by contractors, by NGOs, even by the military, right? And this did not have a local economic impact. Whereas in the Soviet period, the majority of aid was channeled through the Afghan state. And actually, when you look at the big projects, there was a remarkable success. So when we think of the development component with respect to the two wars, it was, the Soviet one is actually quite efficient. There was, of course, spillages on the local ground. It was not uncommon that resources were in the countryside would go missing and end up in black markets. That, of course, happened, but that happens that happened in the post-2001 period as well, because the state did not have that legibility, right? At the in the provinces, the state was not as legible. It had to rely on these clientelistic networks and so on. So that's the development side. And this is actually even the relative Soviet success in development assistance is impressive when you think about the geopolitical differences, which is what we should really think of, right? The Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s was a major theater in the Cold War. You saw the amount of resources channeled into that conflict, whether boots on the ground, right, Soviet boots as well, or the immense millions of dollars, or billions of dollars, I should say, that was channeled into Pakistan to the jihadis, right? Weapons, NGOs were even involved, European NGOs on the side of these reactionary forces, right? So this was a major global event with a lot of resources, and so was 2001. But when you think about the conflicting sides to the party in 2001, it's kind of it's hard to be sympathetic with some of the or it's hard to understand why the US wasn't able to win in Afghanistan, right? Because we can't compare rogue elements of the Pakistani intelligence service to Pakistan and the United States in the 1980s, right? I mean, the Taliban initially was 20,000. It was maybe 20 to 40,000 strong in 2001, 2002, right? So, and and it's very interesting. The history of the war in 2001 is such that as the U.S. military intervened, the more it intervened, the stronger the resistance got, and because of a lot of hubris, right? I mean, there were also Pakistan was a major ally in 2000. I mean, it's always been a major ally. The Pakistani military is linked to the U.S. military and the British military, and yet they are surprised when elements of the Pakistani state are harboring the Afghan Taliban, right? So again, the post-2000 war should be viewed in a very suspect way, and we know this. They've admitted as such. I mean, recently there was the Washington papers, the Afghanistan papers in 2019. You know, the U.S. Congress had created this bipartisan effort to look into why the Afghanistan war had gone awry, or why it had gone bad. So there was a special commission. They had interviewed all the key actors, and then there was, there was a document that was released. Okay, we made some decisions, we made some poor decisions early on. We didn't build the Afghan army, in the 2000s as we should have. Anyway, so there was reporters that were not satisfied with what this commission had outlined, and so they filed for a Freedom of Information Act. And then this is when in 2019 you had these Afghanistan papers, right? It was a major scandal that the Washington Post had unearthed, and in those interviews it had proved that the U.S. military brass and the intelligence brass, they were lying. They were lying about the successes during the 2000s, and then they also had all sorts of information that Pakistan was harboring the Taliban, right? So and again, Pakistan is a major ally, right, of the United States. So the 2000 war doesn't make sense. By all accounts, it is a conspiracy. I think it is a conspiracy because there's no logic to that war. There's no logic to that war, and a lot of people have. The other interesting thing too is that they invaded ostensibly to remove Al Qaeda, and they did that relatively quickly. Within the first couple of months, they removed Al Qaeda from Afghanistan, and the Taliban, after the invasion, was willing to enter into peace agreements, and the U.S. intelligence said no, right? So then they waged that war. That was an unnecessary war. The Soviet-Afghan war is completely different. The United States was motivated to destroy the last communist revolution in the region, and this even this even continued throughout. Once the Soviets were retreating from Afghanistan, there was Geneva peace agreements, and within the U.S. security state, there was two groups. There was the bleeders and the dealers. The bleeders were aligned with the CIA. The dealers were aligned with the State Department, and the bleeders ultimately had the ear of Reagan, so essentially the idea is that in the 1980s, as the Soviet Union was pulling out, the Americans and the Pakistanis, they obstructed a peace deal between the Afghan communists and the opposition, and this would have disastrous effects when the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, and then aid did not flow to Afghanistan, because at that point, the opposition, the jihadis, who were still funded by Pakistan and the U.S., they moved in, and then there was a civil war where the Taliban came to power. And this is not something I'm just saying. This is something that Diego Cordovez, who was he was the Ecuadorian head of the peace negotiations during the 1980s, to the Geneva Peace Accords, and he had laid a lot of blame on the United States and Pakistan for not following through on a peace during the 1980s, right? So these two conflicts, the Soviet-Afghan War and the post-2000 war, you cannot compare these two things. No less thinking that, or bearing in mind that the United States is what caused, Al Qaeda and jihadism and the debacle in 2001 to begin with in the first place, right? So it's a full circle moment, and even now, this has all ended with reaction, right? The Taliban and political Islamic forces in the region, they do not pose an alternative. In the 20th century, you had genuine alternatives in nationalism, in progressivism, and the Soviet Union was key here, right? We should not forget that China, North Vietnam, Algeria, all these other places, Egypt at one point, Syria, they were supported. A lot of these progressive movements were supported. Progressive nationalism, progressive reform. And there were not all of these were necessarily communist parties in the Middle East, the greater Middle East, but the Soviet Union supported this real modernization, this real catch-up. And then now we're in a position where reaction reigns in the region, and political Islamic parties and movements, they don't offer any alternatives. There is no regional anchor. Iran is not a regional anchor. Turkey or Saudi Arabia, it's Iran suffers from sanctions, so they have their own problems to deal with, but Iran is also a very unequal society between the haves and have-nots, right? Whereas a lot of the previous reformists in the region were advocating for welfare, for genuine welfare, for education, for, essentially Central Asia. Look at Central Asia. I know things have deteriorated in the post-1991 period, but Central Asia had achieved more modernization, and the Caucasus as well, than the Middle East. And this is no less because of the Soviet Union.
Sache,